For years, Valve has been fighting the Wolfire Games vs. Valve antitrust litigation, a case that threatens the foundation of the Steam platform and carries potential damages that would bankrupt other companies. We've talked about all the paperwork, interviews, and back and forth so far, but all of that is being pushed to the side. On December 1st, Valve's legal team filed what is arguably the most strategically devastating document the plaintiffs have faced yet. They are using a legal defeat suffered by the FTC in a massive lawsuit against Meta platforms as a shield to protect Steam. This new legal precedent could invalidate the plaintiff's entire theory of harm, potentially causing the lawsuit to collapse before it ever reaches a jury. If you're a developer or a gamer, you need to understand exactly why this filing matters more than every previous document combined. To understand the genius of Valve's new move, we have to quickly revisit the core claims of the plaintiffs. The central claim of the developers in Valve's class action antitrust lawsuit is that Valve holds an unlawful monopoly in the market for PC game distribution. The plaintiffs highlight two anti-competitive practices. First, the 30% commission. Steam takes a 30% cut of game sales, which scales down for high-volume titles. The argument is that this rate is artificially high because there is no true competition, forcing Valve to lower it. Second is the price parity most favored nation clauses. Until recently, Valve used agreements that effectively prevented developers from selling their games cheaper on rival stores like the Epic Games Store or GOG, even if those competitors offered a lower commission. The plaintiffs argue that this locks competitors out and maintains Steam's price control. But the plaintiff's entire case depends on convincing a judge that the relevant market is narrowly defined as digital PC game distribution. According to their numbers, if that market is isolated, Steam holds an overwhelming market share, high enough to classify it as monopoly power. Before we look at the new document, we have to look at the money though, because the numbers are terrifying for this case. The claims argues that Steam's practices have resulted in higher game prices. Their expert economists have calculated the overcharge, the difference between the 30% commission Valve charges and the 17 to 18% rate they argue would succeed in a truly competitive market. According to expert testimony presented during the class certification phase, this difference applied retroactively across the class period, which means the alleged overcharge to developers could exceed $3.1 billion. But here's the detail that most people miss, and it is the reason Valve is fighting this case so hard. Under the Sherman Antitrust Act, damages are punitive, so if the plaintiffs win, the court is authorized to award treble damages. Treble means triple. If the jury finds that Valve owes $3.1 billion in actual damages, the law effectively mandates that the judge multiply that number by 3. We are talking about a potential liability of over $9 billion. So this lawsuit is a massive threat to Steam's future. However, Valve's recent filings have shifted the case entirely. The document we are focusing on is Valve's notice of supplemental authority in support of their motion for summary judgment. A motion for summary judgment is a powerful legal tool that allows one party to ask the judge to decide the case before it ever goes to a jury trial. It is a request for the judge to rule that based on all the evidence gathered so far, there is no genuine dispute over the essential facts, and based on the law, the opposing side cannot possibly win. If the judge grants summary judgment to Valve, the case would be dismissed, and the developers get nothing. If the judge denies it, the case proceeds to a jury trial. Valve is relying on a massive legal defeat suffered just 2 weeks ago by the Federal Trade Commission in their antitrust case against Meta platforms. In that case, the FTC tried to argue that Meta had an illegal monopoly in the personal social networking market, but a US district judge threw the case out because the FTC defined the market too narrowly. They tried to pretend that TikTok and YouTube didn't count as real competition. Valve's lawyers are now holding up that ruling and telling the judge in this antitrust case, look at this, the exact same legal logic applies to Steam. Valve is utilizing two specific silver bullets from the judge's ruling. The first is market definition. The judge ruled that you cannot define a market so narrowly that you exclude obvious competitors just to make a company look like a monopoly. Judge Boasberg rejected the FTC's attempts to manufacture a monopoly by defining an artificially narrow market. He relied on evidence of the increasing similarities or convergence between projects that the FTC attempted to exclude. With just TikTok included, Facebook's market share was nowhere near the guideposts provided by case law for monopoly power, which the Supreme Court has suggested requires a market share of at least 75%. So Valve is applying this directly to PC gaming. The plaintiffs want the relative market to be PC games only. Valve is arguing that just as the court couldn't ignore TikTok when judging Facebook, the court cannot ignore PlayStation, Xbox, and Nintendo when judging Steam. If the market is just PC games, Steam is a giant. But if the market is digital video games including consoles, Steam is just one player among many. If the judge accepts the meta precedent, Steam's market share mathematically drops below the threshold needed to prove a monopoly, and the case collapses. The second point they're pointing to is the profits. The plaintiffs also claim that Steam's high profits, billions of dollars in revenue every single year, are proof of a monopoly. They argue that in a competitive market, these profits would be lower. Valve points back to the judge's opinion where he explicitly rejects that logic. It is always treacherous to try to infer monopoly power from a high rate of return, because high profits can come from shrewd management, exceptional efficiency, booming demand, or risky investments that hit big. So Valve is using a federal judge's own words to argue that making billions of dollars isn't a crime. It's just a sign that they run a better business than anyone else. They are betting everything that the judge in Washington will follow the precedent set by the judge in DC. So Valve is making a direct analogy comparing the FTC's failed market definition to the plaintiff's market definition in the Steam case. Valve will point out that a PC gamer or a developer who is unhappy with Steam's 30% cut has a dozen legitimate other options today, like the Epic Games Store, GOG, and direct launcher sales from major publishers like Riot, Blizzard, and others. As well, Valve argues that the true market is digital gaming, where Steam competes directly with the PlayStation Store, Xbox Store, and Nintendo eShop for developer attention, content, and consumer dollars. So if the judge applies the logic established in FTC versus Meta, Valve's market share in the broader digital video game distribution market immediately drops well below the 60 to 70% threshold typically required to prove monopoly power. The filing of this supplemental authority in their summary judgment motion immediately puts the pressure back on the Wolfire plaintiffs. They must now dedicate substantial resources to convincing the court that the PC game distribution market is somehow different from the social media market. They must prove that PC and console gaming are not substitutes, which is a difficult argument given cross-platform releases and crossplay. Plus, that the Meta ruling shouldn't apply to this specific type of antitrust case. So the judge's decision on this motion will determine the entire future of this lawsuit. If Valve wins this, the entire multi-billion-dollar claim evaporates, and Steam's 30% cut is essentially legally approved as the result of market success, not monopoly. If the judge denies the motion, the case will proceed to a messy, long trial. This is the moment we discover whether Steam's dominance is a monopoly or simply the result of a superior, successful platform. If you want to stay up to date on what the judge rules, make sure you subscribe and like this video.